Hi, this is Paul. This is actually part two to the video I made last week on Noel Plum's response to, well, his idea that Jordan Peterson is destroying Christianity. Think Club did a response video to Noel Plum, and I wanted to interact with this video a little bit because there are some good pieces in it, but I differ from Adam a little bit in where Adam is going with this. So let's jump in here.
Now, Noel's argument seems to be that Jordan Peterson is selling a brand of intellectual Christianity people are no longer buying. Noel finds this reality fantastic and actually goes on to praise Jordan Peterson for helping Noel in his cause to make the world more irreligious. Now, the evidence he produces for this argument I find rather dubious. Noel uses quotes from the UK clergy and stats indicating falling rates of church.
And actually, in my video, a conversation with Glenn, Glenn was really helpful in shining a little bit of light on some of this UK stuff. But a little bit later, I'm going to talk about the decline of the mainline, what's going on with evangelicals, and especially what's going on with nominals. And I'm going to bring Tim Keller into that conversation.
Engagement to make the argument that this intellectual Christianity is what's causing this decline in church affiliation. Now, the problem that I have with this argument is Noel draws no causal connection between the declining church affiliation that he cites and this growing brand of Christian intellectualism that he cites. And without some evidence that one is linked to the other, it's very hard to make a case that the cause of this decline in religiosity or church affiliation is actually being driven by the unappealing nature of the intellectual brand of Christianity that Jordan Peterson and others in the UK clergy that he cites are promoting. Now, I have a few clips here.
Now, I think Adam is right that it's not the intellectual nature of Jordan Peterson that will cause the destruction of Christianity. It has nothing really to do with the intellectual nature at all, because there are intellectuals on both sides. I think it has more to do with the secularity, and maybe Adam and I will have a conversation about that, because he and I have been corresponding a little bit offline about, what's with Jordan Peterson's rise. What's the relationship between Jordan Peterson and drinking soda, and secularity, because that's a part of this puzzle. So let's drop out of here. Now, where Adam goes with this is a really helpful clip from Thomas Putnam, a sociologist. And if you haven't figured out, Adam's take on the whole Jordan Peterson thing is really through Jonathan Haidt and sociology. And I really appreciate Adam as a conversation partner in that, because he's bringing a lot of that stuff in. Stuff that I'd read Haidt quite a bit before, but he keeps bringing the sociological perspective into this in many ways against the anti-theists. But I thought this clip was really a good one and an important one.
Pause for just 1 second, because this next point may be a little bit of a surprise. It was a shock to us. One thing that is implicit in what I've just finished saying is that people are adjusting their politics to fit their religion, or adjusting their religion to fit their politics. More and more people have consistent views in religious and political terms, right? There are more and more, you can predict whether someone's going to be religious or not religious by their politics, or vice versa. So we have fewer and fewer church-going progressives in America, and fewer unchurched conservatives. So here's the question. When people are in that anomalous situation, they're in one of those two boxes. Either they're religious and progressive, or they're unreligious and conservative. What do they change? Because that shows they're changing. What do they change? Do they change their politics to fit their religion, or do they change their religion to fit their politics? Pardon?
Change the religion to fit the politics.
It's difficult to hear, but the woman says they changed their religion to fit their politics.
Yeah, I didn't believe that, actually. I was certain that could not be. Our data showed that, but I just could not believe it, because I said to myself, remember, there's what's at stake here. If you're a believer, what's at stake is your eternal fate.
Okay, that's a very non-secular perspective. And that's fundamental. That's fundamental here, because this is his assumption about how believers work. And so these were the expectations he brought, and he's a good scientist, and therefore, to his surprise, he saw, oh, people are changing their religion to suit their politics.
And that goes on for a long time. So even with a discount rate, it's going to be, a lot depends. And I couldn't believe that people would be making decisions with that import about their permanent, their fate, based on how they felt about, Bill Clinton or George W. Bush. It just didn't seem to me to add up. And I thought people would be going to church, they'd be hearing the sermons, they'd be becoming more conservative, or they'd be not at church, they wouldn't hear the sermons, therefore they would become more progressive. But no, you're right. Most people are changing their religion to fit their politics.
And this gets into the question often that people imagine that, and I hear this often, that, well, it's these pastors that are changing the minds of the people. Well, pastors do have some influence, but people usually pick their pastor, not usually, but people often pick their pastor according to what they want to hear the pastor say. And as soon as the pastor starts saying things the people don't want to hear, they go and find a new pastor who's going to tell them what they want to hear. This is not uncommon or not unknown in the church world. This happens all the time. I want to get into a little bit of history of politics and religion, because actually in the ancient world, politics and religion were one thing. Listen to Jordan Peterson's biblical lectures. Marduk is at the top of the hierarchy, and the king of Babylon is beneath him. It's one hierarchy of politics and religion. They were one thing. Now, what happens in the Hebrew prophets, you can read this in Ezekiel. I've got an online class from that on my church channel. You can hear it in Daniel. What happens with the Hebrew prophets is that, as Jordan Peterson talks about polytheism and how that works, what's supposed to happen is that when the Hebrews are conquered, the Hebrews become polytheistic Babylonians. But the entire nature of the entire history of the development of Hebrew monotheism meant that when the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, the Jews flipped the script. And you can read it in Jeremiah, you can read it throughout the Old Testament prophets. The prophets began saying God was ordaining the destruction of his own temple through Babylon. And basically what the book of Daniel is about is this struggle between, well, are the gods of Babylon the Most High God, or is the God of Daniel the Most High God? And that is negotiated through the book of Daniel. Book of Daniel says outright, world leaders were ordained by God for his own reason, even at the expense of his son, Israel. That's the language of the prophets. You can read that in the book of Hosea. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Israel is God's son. Israel is God's servant. The Hebrew prophets used all these different kind of metaphors. Israel is God's wife. And these metaphors all locate Israel in relationship with the Lord, the God of Israel. Now, they begin to say that God is on top of the hierarchy and is ordaining this. But what happens when your nation loses its independence? Now, Jordan Peterson gets from Northrop Frye very much the correct idea that in the Old Testament you have a nation, but when your God is at the top of the hierarchy, but you no longer have kings which serve that God, now suddenly you have space for disconnect. And this leaves room when we get to the New Testament for, as Jordan Peterson would talk about, the individual. And this is where we get individual Christianity. And what this does in terms of the matrix of politics and religion is it alters it. Jesus is the Son of God, but he's called out of Egypt and killed by empire. You can only understand Jesus in the light of the Hebrew scriptures if you begin to understand how the Hebrew prophets change the conversation from what everyone in the ancient Near East would assume, which is you have the God on top and his king underneath. Now, what the Hebrew prophets allow to happen is there's a pagan king underneath, but God is still on top, and God is working through his rebellious servants, even when his rebellious servants don't get it. And the transition from Daniel 3, 4, and 5 is the story about Nebuchadnezzar and how he comes to respect the Most High God, even as he is not truly a son of Israel. He never uses the word the Lord in that. And I've been preaching about this. Again, that's on my church channel. Christianity comes along and really embodies this. Christianity, religion, and ethnicity were separated. And in the empire, again, and that alignment between ethnicity and your God meant that the Babylonians had their Babylonian God. Everybody had their gods. Now with the empire and polytheism, the polytheism was the lubrication between the gods. So you could have your ethnic god, you could have your civic god, you could have your imperial god, and they all kind of had their sphere of influence. And you could have your private god, and whatever you needed. The gods were it was like a mall of gods, and you could go and find the god that best fit whatever your needs were or whatever your tastes were. And that idea behind polytheism remains attractive in certain religions that continue to have polytheistic elements. And you find that both in the folk religion level, it might work in terms of saints. I'm going to find my saint for whatever I'm looking for. Or in, say, something like Hinduism, where you actually have gods that are supposed to be emulation of the god. And Hinduism works that in different ways. But what happens in Christianity is that there's one God, but that God is now working. You can be a Hebrew and worship that God. You can be, in the language of the New Testament, a Greek, which means that you come from this massive group of nations that were first conquered by the Greeks and then by the Romans. And you can be a member of the empire, and you can be a Christian. And it's in Antioch, when Paul and Barnabas go to Antioch, and you can read about that in the book of Acts, that they're first called Christians because they don't know what to call them. Because you used to designate a person's God by a person's ethnicity. Well, he's a Jew, so he's got the Jewish God. He's a Babylonian, so he's got the Babylonian God. He's a Roman, so he's got the Roman gods. But they didn't know what to call the Christians because their ethnic designation or their political designation no longer lined up with the hierarchy that they had. Okay? And so Peter and Paul then go on in their letters to say exactly what Daniel 4 says, is that God puts these emperors in charge, even if they are unworthy emperors, and we should submit to them conditionally. But if we refuse to submit to them, we should be ready to pay the price. And you see that with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel, and both Peter and Paul are killed by Nero. Yet Caesar kills them both, but still they say God still put that Caesar in charge. Now, one of the fun things is if you take a look at Melinda Selmis, who a couple of years ago, she is a Roman Catholic. She has a blog on Patheos. She's written some interesting books on sexuality. She's gay, but an observant and a submitting Roman Catholic, and so she's in a heterosexual marriage, and she writes openly about this, about how she navigates this. But one of my favorite things it's actually from one of her books that she puts on her blog, is, well, the gay Roman emperor gene, because when you look at these emperors, these people were, according to any Christian ethic, enormously immoral people. And these people would be immoral people no matter how woke or libertine people would be. Julius Caesar had homosexual relations. It is generally thought that they were politically motivated. He was willing to indulge his political patrons in order to gain prestige and dignitas within the Roman world. He was also willing to establish such favors from his inferiors as a way of securing their political loyalty and establishing his dominance over them. That's how sexuality worked. And what you can begin to see is that these constructions we tend to have, these fixed categories, when you look at them in different cultures, well, things aren't quite so fixed as you imagine. And this, to me, gets into Jung's great insight that I learned about as I was reading his autobiography, when he begins to see, well, the stuff out there and the stuff in here, these things align. And so actually, there's a lot of alignment that's always going on inside of us, and we're not very aware of it, but this is how morality and human beings work. But my point is that these emperors, these were not godly people in any kind of sense that the Old Testament would recognize, or the New for that matter. Tiberius, by all accounts, was a sex addict. In this case, it's not even likely that there were spurious rumors spread by his worst enemies. We have incriminating evidence in the mosaics in his palace in Capri. If you ever go to a Sexaholics Anonymous meeting, you'll quickly discover that sex addiction often crosses gender lines. It has nothing to do with sexual orientation, but rather seeking the largest possible pool of sexual partners and experiences. And if you just Google Tiberius and sex, you'll get an idea of the kinds of things he did. Caligula, famous for this. Nero, Hadrian. I mean, this is what the Roman emperors were like. And here God says, through Daniel and Paul and Peter say, God put these people in charge, and Christians are supposed to submit to them conditionally. Okay? And that's where you begin to see religion and politics separating out. Now, with the fall of the Roman Empire, the church in the West is the last institution standing, and the church begins to fill the void of the empire in terms of organizing and administering the life of the people. And politics is a huge mess with all these tribal groups, these barbarians, rises and falls, and the church becomes kind of the one founding institution. But over time, through the Middle Ages, the political environment begins to stabilize, nation states begin to form, and kings, then we begin to see get into power struggles with the institutional church. In other words, the empire fell, the church takes over, civic governments begin to express themselves and challenge the church, and now the church and the civic governments have to work out this relationship. And it's within these struggles that the Protestant Reformation is born. And it's noteworthy that the Protestant Reformation is born in the Holy Roman Empire, which was probably the most chaotic patchwork of Europe with all of these levels. The Reformation is suppressed in France. The Reformation doesn't really go anywhere in Italy, but it does take root in northern and western Europe, in Germany, the lowlands, in Switzerland, and in England. And you have Henry VIII and his famous struggle with the Pope and his separation of the church in England from the Roman Catholic Church, and the civil wars that were fought over that. Eventually, there's the Peace of Augsburg, where the civil authority determines the religion of their region. This is where, in a sense, the civic governments have religious power over the institutions. And that's a way of trying to bring peace and order and structure to Europe, as in the aftermath of the Reformation, chaos just abounds in terms of what's going on in northern and western Europe. Now, America comes along with this secular experiment of government. In previous videos, I've talked about the loss of authority of the text. In the early Middle Ages, up until the High Middle Ages, about the time of the Reformation and after, if you were going to study physics, you studied the texts of Aristotle, and you learned physics from Aristotle. You didn't learn it from the real world. You didn't have science experiments where you're dropping balls and these kinds of things. This is what happens with Galileo and Newton, where there's a turn from texts and a turn towards the natural world, okay? And in the Reformation, Reformation led to these inter-Christian wars. You have the kind of a loss of confidence in texts. And so certainty is looked for in reason from above, empiricism from below. But you still have the question, is the world a forum for action or a space of objects? This is the question that Jordan Peterson begins Maps of Meaning with. And now this eventually leads to the split world, where, and this is something that many of you will be familiar with because to one degree or another, many of you inherited this split view of the world, where science teaches us about this external world of objects, and the truth is revealed in material physics, but the Bible and religion reveal moral truths. And so right there you have the split between a world of objects and a forum for action. And you'll hear it said again and again, the Bible isn't a science textbook, but it's a moral guidebook on right and wrong and how to get to heaven when you die. And in the modern period, this is the split that happens between the world. Now, in Europe, World War I kills and ends Christendom in a big way. This is a deeply religious war. It marks the end of the optimism of this split world agreement, and the European church begins a long, steady retreat. That doesn't happen this way in the Americas. World War II and the Cold War, America recruits God to fight its battle, and church attendance reaches its peak during the Cold War in North America, and they continue to practice the split world, where you have science and material reveal truth in that realm and that magisterium, and the Bible reveals moral truth, and that continues to govern. And the mainline churches, the United Church of Canada, where Jordan Peterson was a little boy, mainline churches throughout the United States, these were the forms in which this split world was practiced. In fundamentalist churches, the world wasn't split. You had things like creation science, and we're getting all of our ideas about truth in the world from the Bible. Now, it's important to recognize that the roots of religion in America is very different than what it was in Europe. Look at the first two colonies in the Americas, New England, Plymouth, and Jamestown. Plymouth is made up of religious refugees trying to found the new earth, the new heavens and the new earth, trying to found God's perfect society, God's perfect religious society in New England. Jamestown, they're economic opportunists. And again, you can read the book 1493 to get into, how in Jamestown, when they find tobacco, boy, that booms. And, tobacco's this new drug, and it goes all throughout the world, and they're growing it like crazy in Jamestown and in the Caribbean. Now, these two motivations mark much of American immigration. What are the two reasons people come to America? Refuge from political and religious oppression, economic opportunity. This remains the same even today. American culture seems to fertilize religion in a particular way that's different from the old world, from Europe. And the U.S. has been both secular and religious. And the U.S. has kind of carved that out, whereas, say, in France, you put up the idol of reason in Notre Dame after the French Revolution. In America, it was much more, let 1,000 flowers bloom. You go ahead and you practice, your community can practice its individual religious expression, and we'll have kind of two sets of rules. In the public sphere, we'll have democratic process, and a majority determines. For much of American history, that was very waspy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Late 20th century, Roman Catholics start to assert themselves. Other religions come in and assert themselves. So, but basically you have keep church and state kind of separate. Be as religious as you want at home, but out in the public sphere, we're going to have a majority rules process. And so if religious people are in the majority, you might have prayer before football games. You might have prayer before public meetings. But those are the two rules that are going to be working, and that kind of aligns with the split world. Now Putnam assumes that religion proposes and politics disposes. And what he sees from the data is that it is not that simple. Our perceived position in a status hierarchy is powerful, and this will powerful enough to change many people's religious orientation. Now, this is where we get into the question of how religious is someone. We have this category called nominals, and you have very observant people, hang on. So you have nominal believers, and they tend to be second, third, fourth, fifth generation. You have these practices that linger in the family, and you do it just because you've done it. You've got language that lingers. You believe in God, but you don't necessarily attend church very faithfully. You don't necessarily give a lot of money. You don't necessarily have a lot of the practices and the disciplines, such as prayer and fasting and some of these kinds of things. So you have nominals that are just kind of weak Christians or formal Christians. That's what the word nominal means. And then you have highly observant believers, and not just Christians, but Jews and Muslims and all the other varieties of religious too. So you have nominalism as a factor in American life. And the height of the height of church attendance during the Cold War had a lot of nominalism in it, because it was to be a good American meant to go to church. After the Cold War, this is what falls away. Now, George Marsden actually does a lot of writing about this, and there's a really interesting video out there that I found this morning and listened to, where he goes through the history of Brown University. And George Marsden is an expert on American religious Christian history, and he's written a terrific book, The Soul of the American University, where he actually chronicles how the details of how Christianity founded the universities, and how the universities were made in service of Christianity, and how different that world was. And then as he says in the subtitle, from Protestant establishment to established non-belief. That's what happened in the American universities. So Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, these were all religious organizations. And from the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, religion recedes from them. And one of the best people that talks about this that you can find clips on is, in fact, Dallas Willard. And what Dallas Willard notes is the splitness, how the splitness continues to go. In secular status hierarchy, you lose status by asserting the supernatural. It's the reverse in Christian and church context. Worldviews are promoted and enforced by social status. So I'm going to play a little bit of this Veritas Forum clip from Dallas Willard.
When it comes to these worldview questions, you see the same issue of truth is there. And the question of how do we know the truth still applies to those, not just about whether in your pocket, but, for example, whether you're going to continue conscious existence when your brain is no longer functioning. Right? That's a good question of fact. And now, how we settle that, that's a difficult thing to argue about. But if it is true, then it's true regardless of what you or I may think about it. I often shock my students, we're discussing Descartes or someone, I ask them, what if it turns out you can't stop existing? Well, I mean, there you have Hamlet's problem, don't you? He wasn't sure he could make an end of himself with a bare bodkin, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub, right? So now here's a question of fact or truth. And it has incredible bearings on how we approach our life. Am I fundamentally a material object that exists, gets organized by DNA and exists for a little while and then I stop existing? Or am I an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's universe? Wow, what a difference. See? Now, the main worldview questions We can go on to slide 5. Basically, you can boil them down to 3. You can add a couple more here and there, but the main ones are the nature of reality. What is reality? And then, of course, associated with this, what counts as knowledge of reality? Because knowledge enables us to negotiate reality and to hopefully live in some comfortable relationship to it. I often define reality as what you run into when you're wrong. And often that is an unpleasant experience. And so, you know, if you're counting on there being gas in your tank and it's not there, well, you will run into a reality that will strand you on the freeway, and who knows what will happen to you then. So, I mean, the nature of reality is a crucial question. Is a human being, go back to the case I'm using to illustrate, are they just a physical organism? Is all there is to thought and will and artistic genius and aspiration and knowledge of a whole field of French literature or something, is that just chemistry? So now that's one of the major questions. Another major question is, who's well off? And you would immediately reply, of course, students at UCLA, because they have a bright future, right? And that's at USC, we promise everyone they're going to be successful. But this is a profound question. Who is well off? And can you still be well off if you have cancer? Or if you don't get your PhD? Or you don't have enough money to go on and get your BA degree? Can you still be well off? Who is well off? And that is a profound worldview question that reflects itself in nearly everything that we do. Who is a really good person? That's another big one. Actually, people are more concerned about that one than they are about who's well off. You can get a fight out of someone by questioning whether they're a really good person much quicker than you can by questioning whether they're well off. You know, you say, well, you must not be well off. You don't drive a Lexus. They'll look at you and shrug. But I can give you some other language that they will fight you right quickly, you see. So that's one of the deep questions. Am I a good person? It's one of the deepest worldview questions that human beings deal with. They're constantly concerned about it. If you have any doubts about it, your blood pressure will immediately go up. Right. I mean, try it. I am a stinker. Blood pressure goes up, right? Or even Joe thinks I'm a stinker, right? Blood pressure goes up. I mean, these are really pervasive questions that trouble us all the time. Well, let me hasten on. I mean, the truth of the matter is, I mean, we could list others, like how do you get to be a good person? That's a good one. Questions about what counts as knowledge is very big on the campus. See, those are worldview questions. They organize our lives as a whole. Now, what I want to say is that all teaching institutions, great teachers, even little teachers, give answers to these questions.
This is what you saw in the abolition of man. This is what you see in almost everything, because these are the questions that dominate. And they used to dominate in the university, and the university used to orient these questions in religious terms. These questions still remain functional out in society, and they are fundamentally religious questions, but they are also deeply embedded in politics. And so that's why politics is kind of the technology to religion being the science. These things are deeply intertwined. And this is why, as Putnam notes, these two things are varying together, but people are, in a sense, wagging the dog. And that's why Putnam is surprised, because people are changing their religion to fit their politics. People are changing their science to fit their technology.
And I mention here Jesus, because he's one of the most obvious people to mention. There never has been anyone who has been more influential in his teaching about these things than Jesus.
And this then gets into the interesting conversation with Sam Harris, because what Peterson notes is that Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, many of the celebrity atheists actually have implicit within their moral structure the teachings of Jesus, but Jesus becomes a persona non grata. Jesus becomes a dirty word. We cannot say Jesus when we talk about treating people as individuals. We cannot say Jesus when we talk about being sacrificial towards other people. We cannot say Jesus when we talk about the very ideas that Jesus promoted in the Sermon on the Mount and other places in the New Testament. We just call them, well, this is just modern morality. But don't say we got it from Jesus, because then suddenly it's religious. And actually, I would argue that religion on the right and the left both have within them ideas about Jesus. I do not believe the West would have gotten to the idea of same-sex marriage or LGBT rights without underneath it the ideas of Jesus talking about respect for the individual and respect for individuals' choices and generosity towards the outcast. The entire movement, in some ways, of the left, the entire movement of the ethics of the left is generosity towards the dispossessed. And this you can find in the Old Testament prophets, and you can find it in Jesus. The question is, how does that one value function within the hierarchy of values? I've been getting into this in my Sunday school class on 1 John. The hierarchy of values as respects to love.
But of course, he's not the only one. Plato, the Buddha, Freud, and UCLA. UCLA answers these questions. They convey an impression of the truth of a certain worldview. In the university setting, the dominating worldview is expressed through what is accepted as research and what counts as possible knowledge.
Now, when you get to Peter Boghossian and his assertion that intersectionality is the new religion, that's their beef, because they're saying this has gotten into the university knowledge structure.
So I asked you about the dinosaur and whether or not any of you thought about being eaten by one on the way here tonight. No. Well, let me give you another one. Is there a single course of studies on this campus? And I don't, I'm just picking on you because that's where we are. USC, Berkeley, or wherever it is, all the same. Is there a single course of studies on this campus that you're engaged in that regards knowledge of God as a part of the subject matter?
Listen to that again.
Regards on this campus that you're engaged in that regards knowledge of God as a part of the subject matter. A single one. Where you might be a part of your expertise in that field, or your grade might be determined by something you had to say about God. You see, that's the sociological reality. What Dr. Kuhn said is so cogent.
And I wish they had included that in this lecture, because I've heard him say this. I have no idea what Dr. Kuhn said.
And so forceful. And when you understand what he said, you just wonder, how can people not understand this? But the truth of the matter is, people who are caught up in the sociological wave will hear it all and dismiss it. Because to them, it's just like the dinosaur. And what I want to do this evening especially is to just take the time to insist that you are in a system which teaches a worldview without responsibly defending it. How is a worldview taught? Well, mainly it's taught by body language, facial expressions, tones of voice and inflections, looks, offhand remarks about people and events, by what is permissible.
And this is where I'm surprised that Putnam didn't pick this up, because a worldview is taught by sociology. It's taught by all of the implicit status markers that Well, who is a good person? Who is a person better than another person? How does the hierarchy work? That's how worldview is taught. And so therefore, in the political realm, because politics is in a sense the application of religion, well, this is all the subtle things. And you're losing status by what you believe about homosexuality. Okay? Watch, it was a Roman Catholic woman who was getting raked over the coals. She was up for a judge nomination. And watch how this is often, how often conservative judges that are brought before the Congress for confirmation, where they get tagged on the question of the morality of same-sex unions. Well, it's different, and Tim Keller's going to talk about this. I don't know if I'll play that all the way through. But the question of whether or not same-sex unions should be permissible in the United States is actually different from the morality of same-sex unions. Because, for example, most people will agree that adultery is immoral, but almost no one in the United States is saying that adultery should be illegal, that the government should be enforcing marriage. Now, it enforces marriage in some respects, but if you commit adultery on your spouse, you are not going to jail for it. And so you have the definition, well, but you might say, well, that's immoral, but it's not illegal. And so there are many people in the United States, frankly, myself included, that says, I don't have a problem with same-sex marriage being legal, but the question of its morality isn't necessarily identical to the question of its legality. Now, people will push back and say, but if you call them immoral, then they're second-class citizens. But if you say that people who don't embrace the morality of same-sex unions, now you've made them second-class citizens. And the difficulty is that often certain groups will say they're a little bit more comfortable with understanding a hierarchy than other people. Well, we can't have any hierarchies. Well, actually, if you listen to that George Marsden video, he'll get into that a little bit too. So one of the amazing things that I saw last week was the Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, Joe Rogan experience, and I'd actually seen the earlier video that Peter Boghossian did at Portland State University, where here you have these, and Peter Boghossian is a full-out anti-theist. He has written a book on how to make atheists, and he's had some interesting conversations with Phil Vischer. One of the things I like about Peter Boghossian is Peter Boghossian seems to be the kind of guy that will have productive conversations with Christians about these things, and he's a reasonable guy, and he actually says this. It's easy for him to talk to Christians about these kinds of things. I think his reason, I'll probably play a clip of that in an upcoming video at some point. I think he's wrong in terms of the reason why Christians can talk to him about these things. But Peter Boghossian is an atheist that I could have a long and fruitful conversation with. And what Peter Boghossian is saying, he can't have a conversation with this new secular religion because they're not looking to have a talk. They're just looking to win, and win at almost any cost. And this, of course, gets into the Jordan Peterson stuff. But now we've known for a while that religious communities have been shifting in the United States. And again, I've said church attendance reached its peak during the Cold War. The real question is, well, Mr. Plum is right that mainline Christianity, like secularized Anglicanism, see, it's not the intellectual function, it's the secularizing function. And you get this in Dallas Willard's conversation, because Dallas Willard says, well, what's happened in the university, and George Marsden makes the same point, is that, at least in secular university, the dual practice of America, that keep your religion private, the secular realm is supposed to, the public sphere is supposed to be secular, no God talk, unless the majority agrees with God talk. And you can still find that in certain segments of the United States, but that's embattled. People are drawn to church for a lot of reasons. Sometimes they're not conscious of them. So you have this ongoing conversation. Well, are evangelical numbers falling? Mainline numbers are going through the floor. And that's what Noel Plum sees in in England. Now, one of the most interesting conversations in this was done by Tim Keller in 2013 with an organization called the Faith Angle Forum. And Martin Cromartie used to be the leader of this. He did an excellent job stewarding fascinating conversations between religious leaders and the press. And unfortunately, they haven't kept all of their videos up. This Tim Keller conversation was, in fact, a video. The first time I saw it, it was a video. Now I can only find the MP3 online, and so I'm going to play some of that. But they also have a transcript, so I'm going to play the recording and the transcript. But what Tim Keller does is begin to walk through what's been happening, which is what Putnam is looking at. And Tim Keller begins to diagnose what's been happening in the culture. Now, this conversation is 5 years old, and so things have actually changed quite a bit. Obviously, we've had the emergence of Donald Trump, which I think makes sense given how Tim Keller lays this thing out. So let me pull this up, and let's listen.
Okay. I'm conservative Christianity after the Christian right.
Yep.
I am used to speaking about things that I am absolutely certain of. I am used to speaking about things I would take a bullet for and things I would die for. I would like the record to show
That is the definition of not nominal.
that I'm not willing to die for my opinion on conservative Christianity after the Christian right. I would just like everyone to see that, because this feels like surmise all the way down. But you're journalists, and that's what you do. You surmise, and I'm surmising with you. It's not totally stupid. The reason I said yes, it's not stupid to ask me about this, because first of all, I'm old enough that I was a conservative Protestant Christian before there was a Christian right. I was raised in a kind of a liberal Lutheran church, the LCA, the old LCA. Lutheran Church in America. I became a Christian and an evangelical one at that during college by reading John Stott books and C.S. Lewis books and that sort of thing. And at that time, if you were a theological conservative, it didn't mean you were a political conservative. So I predate the wedding of those two things.
And this is similar to me. I have the same thing. I grew up Christian, but I wasn't a political conservative, but I was a religious conservative. And as Putnam noted, that middle is getting squeezed out. There's still plenty of us out there, but those things don't necessarily track together. And Tim Keller is famously opaque in terms of his political opinions because, probably he, like me, I've got elements of conservatism in my matrix and elements of things more to the left in my matrix. I'm not purely on one side or the other. I see, and I think many people actually have bits of both sides in them.
And now the other thing is, many of you know, the church that I pastor and have pastored for quite a while.
He's retired now.
It's interesting to see Luis's presentation was great, but when he shows me the millennials, what a high percentage of them are unaffiliated, and then the next, the 18 to 29, then the next, those are the people that are there. My church is average, about 32 is the median age, which makes it about 80% under 42 or something like that. And so I live in that world that is totally allergic to institutional religion, and I live amongst what you have to call younger evangelicals. And so it just as well I do speak to this, I guess, because I'm old enough and my church is young enough that maybe I can say something about it. I should also, here's some definitions. Number one, I'm actually a conservative Protestant, as you know, not a conservative Christian only. And conservative Roman Catholics and Orthodox folks, I'm not going to be able to, actually, I'm not a scholar here. I'm here as a practitioner. And as a practitioner, I don't feel like I know enough about those worlds and their numbers and the issues to talk much about them. So about 80% of what I say is really going to fit more conservative Protestant Christianity. So actually it should say conservative Protestant Christianity after the Christian right, because that's mainly what I'm going to talk about. Even though conservative Roman Catholics and conservative Protestants really overlap in so many of their values, and they'd have so many, they could make common cause in so many areas. Nevertheless, I'll make reference to them, but I'm basically thinking about Protestants. Secondly, what is a conservative Protestant? I'll use the Bebbington 4 plus 1. Now, David Bebbington was a sociologist, a British sociologist some years ago that tried to define evangelicalism and came up with these 4. I mean, I haven't found the autograph of what he actually said because it keeps coming down through everybody else, but this is my understanding, is his 4 characteristics were the authority of the Bible. By that, I think it means the Bible as trumps reason and experience. Secondly, the necessity of conversion, of a conversion experience of some kind. Thirdly, salvation through faith in Christ's work on the cross, not good works. Fourth, mission, the idea of activism, needing to take this message to the world. And my 5th one, I would add, even though it may be inherent, it may be implied, I would call it supernatural Christianity. Liberal Christianity tried to redo all of Christian doctrine in terms of naturalistic assumptions, no miracles. And I would say, no, I mean, to me, an evangelical Pentecostal conservative Protestant definitely believes in miracles, believes the resurrection really happened.
Okay, now this is where we get into all the way back to Noel Plum and the conversation, because Noel Plum basically says, well, intelligent Christians jettison this stuff. And that's where he redefines intelligent as someone who doesn't believe in all the things that scare Sam Harris. Tim Keller is saying, well, this is his Bebbington 4 plus 1, that conservative Protestants do believe in miracles. They do believe in the physical resurrection. They do believe in these things. And that's critical for understanding how the different groups have been moving. And I think this is why Noel Plum doesn't understand how secularization has been impacting the Church of England and the main line in the U.S. and Canada.
Somebody once told me, if you ask an Episcopalian minister, did the resurrection really happen? And if he says, well, it depends on what you mean, that means no. So a conservative Protestant says, you ask, did the resurrection really happen? And he says, yes. And other people say, well, it depends on how you look at it. So, in fact, Andrew Delbanco, who I really respect, secular.
And so, whoops, I didn't want that to happen. And so when you get, again, obviously, to Jordan Peterson, with his long, complicated answer, he sets himself apart from the evangelicals, but it's the other aspects that I presented in the other videos in response to Noel Plum's video that also sets him apart from the main line. Jordan Peterson doesn't fit in to the main line or the evangelicals.
Jewish professor of humanities at Columbia University. One time I was on a panel with him, and he was trying to figure out where I was, and I was trying to say, and he says, oh, I get it. You don't take the Apostles' and Nicene Creed metaphorically, do you? I said, bingo, that's it. I don't take it. Okay, conservative Protestantism. And who are they?
Now, see, if I were to have Jonathan Peugeot in this conversation, it would get interesting, because how the Orthodox and the Catholics deal with this question of metaphorical. In a Protestant conversation, the secular Protestant conversation, metaphorical becomes the line. The way Peugeot, like Peterson, metaphorical is not a line, because the world is sacramental. So the stuff of this world is the glove on the hand of God. And so, see, there's a lot of moving pieces here.
I would say, I really appreciate what Louis said yesterday, that if you back out what I would call the soft part of evangelicals, which would be, you have some big denominations like Southern Baptists and very recent Lutheran Church that are so large that they're actually, I think, experiencing a lot of the nominalism and the disaffiliation that mainline churches are experiencing. But then,
okay, so this is where you get into the numbers. So what Keller is going to say is that what's been happening in the church numbers, now again, this surprises a lot of people who aren't aware of it. church numbers are rigorously studied in terms of statistics. There are numerous organizations that are tracking these things carefully. The Pew Studies track them. Lifeway tracks them. The Barna Group track them. People are watching church numbers very, very carefully. And so there's lots of pastors like myself, we track these things. And what Keller is saying, what's been happening in terms of the culture is what's getting wrung out of the church are nominalism. And here he says, there are some conservative denominations like the Southern Baptists, Missouri Synod Lutherans, certain ones that the churches have become so large, such large, powerful institutions, there's a degree of nominalism that gets built in there. Now, when the nominalism gets wrung out, you're going to see numeric decline in those denominations too. But the vast majority of nominalism is going to be in the main line.
You have to back in the churches and people in the main line that are really evangelical. You back them in, you back them out, it comes out about the same. The 7% of black Protestants, regardless of what else you know, the vast majority of them would fit the Bebington 4+5. There is just no doubt about it. So that gets you right now to almost 30% of the population, or close. Less than a third, more than a quarter. And that's what I want to talk about.
See, now this is where we take, see, Noel Plum says, well, it's when people become intellectual, when they begin to take the Bible metaphorically and not historically. In other words, they fail the Bebington 4+1. That's the death of Christianity. Okay, I'll agree to that to a degree, but a lot of people aren't going there, and they're the ones who are not nominal. And I think Putnam is right that this is impacting their politics. But there'll be some cases in which people's change in politics impacts their church. There'll be other cases in which people's religion will impact their politics. In other words, it's not either or, it's both and. And the way to track these numbers is by tracking the nominals. And the nominals are people who aren't practicing. Now, here's the thing about Peterson. Given his religious experiences, which I've talked about in the previous 2 videos about this, I do not consider Peterson nominal, even though he doesn't go to church. Peterson is kind of in his own place, and in that way, Peterson is so difficult to track because in terms of mission, he's evangelical. In terms of worldview, he's semi-mainline in terms of his scientific side, but in terms of his religious side, he's sacramentalist, which is Orthodox and Roman Catholic. And that's why part of the reason he is getting such a wide audience, because the Orthodox and the Catholics look at Peterson and say, oh, a sacramentalist. The evangelicals look at some of Peterson's conservatism and say, and look at his missional heart and say, oh, he's one of us. And then the mainliners look at him and say, yeah, but he's scientifically rigorous, so maybe he's one of us, but we're worried about his politics. But even within the main line, you've got a minority of groups who are still conservative, who are not nominal, and who are, in a sense, keeping the main line alive.
And so I'd like to give you 3 things that I think I'm fairly confident of, at street level, admittedly, fairly confident will happen in the future, okay? And then I'd like to talk to you about some things that might happen in the future that could move the needle either way. So first of all, 3 things that I'm fairly confident of happening. And I'll actually read you these 3 things and then go through them. So I'm down here. One is that conservative Protestant Christianity is going to be growing moderately in numbers and greatly in cultural diversity and racial diversity in a fragmented culture. Secondly, I'll repeat them. Conservative Protestant Christianity is going to become consciously outside the box politically, but not consciously outside the box theologically.
See, and this is where Trump is going to get really interesting, because Trump puts pressure on the morality of Christians, because Trump is a libertine. Compared to Barack Obama, Trump is a libertine and Barack Obama is a Puritan. But this is where the politics and the religion really get complicated. And the black church, a lot voted for Obama, obviously, because he's African American. But religiously, Obama was complicated.
And thirdly, it's going to get both more and less culturally influential at once, with the end result.
So there's his 3 points. Conservative Protestant is going to be growing moderately in numbers and greatly in cultural diversity and racial diversity in a fragmented culture. Second, that conservative Protestant Christianity is going to become consciously outside the box politically, but not consciously outside the box theologically. And right now, we're in the messiness of that mix, and it's not clear exactly, because I don't think Tim Keller saw Donald Trump coming. And thirdly, it's going to get more and less culturally influential simultaneously, with the end result in doubt.
Doubt. Okay, number one. When I say growing moderately, Luis pointed out that whereas the devout people in the country, and over here the secular people, where the big change is, the erosion is in the middle. The devout numbers are not actually going down that much. It depends on how you read them. But basically they're not in free fall by any means. What I think is fair, and I'm really glad I can actually come in. Hopefully this will be really driven in everybody's psyche, because I'll basically say the same thing Luis said, that you don't so much see secularization as polarization, and what's really coming away is the middle.
So now we've seen radical polarization in the last few years politically, but what Keller is saying is that in a longer term, we've been seeing religious polarization.
Now, for example, here's what this means. It's actually very important for what's happening right now. It used to be that the devout and the mushy middle, nominal Christians, people that would identify as Christians, people would come to church sporadically, people would certainly respect the Bible and Christianity. The devout and the mushy middle together was a supermajority of people who just created a kind of Christian-y sort of culture. Now, what's happening is that erosion, and Luis is right in saying lots and lots of unaffiliated people are not atheists or agnostics. But what's happened is it used to be the mushy middle used to be more identified with the devout. Now it's more identified with the secular. That's all. So what's happening is the roof has come off.
Now, what's interesting about Peterson is that it's been the mushy middle, I suspect, that Peterson has been robbing the new atheists of. Because I think initially the mushy middle went for the new atheists, because they'd hear their critiques about Christianity and, oh, yeah, that sounds good. But Peterson is grabbing them and he's changing them. And we're seeing them go to the sacramentalists, and we're seeing them move away from the celebrity atheists, and we're seeing some of them go to becoming more devout. And this is where Peterson is interesting, because Peterson, there's nothing mushy about Peterson. And he doesn't fit the evangelicals, he doesn't fit the mainline, but there's enough mainline in him, and he doesn't fit the sacramentalists, the Catholic and the Orthodox. But he is robbing the mushy middle, and that's the ground that he is harvesting.
For the devout had a kind of a shelter, an umbrella. You couldn't be all that caustic toward traditional kind of classic Christian teaching and truth. I mean, I spoke on Friday morning to the American Bible Society's board. American Bible Society does a lot of polling about the Bible. I don't know why, but and the use of the Bible, reading the Bible, attitudes toward the Bible. They said the very same thing that I heard from Luis, that actually the number of people who are devout Bible readers is not changing that much. What is changing is, for the first time in history, a growing group of people that think the Bible's bad. It's dangerous, it's regressive, it's a bad cultural force. That was just never there. It's very tiny. And that's because the middle ground is shifted, so it's more identified, with, I don't know which, should I be left, right on this? It's more identified with the more secular, the less religious, and it's less identified now with the more devout.
Okay. And again, this is another change that Peterson is bringing, because, so what Keller is saying is that it used to be when you had the devout and the nominals, they made a super majority, and people in America could agree on a whole number of things, like, well, and look at the numbers, and I actually saw some interesting numbers recently, but, well, the Bible is Word of God, but words of God, no, but Word of God, Americans, and Jesus rose from the grave, and all of these things. Americans, even the nominals, would say this. What happened with the anti-theists is they kind of came in and said, okay, the Bible is evil, and then the left, the rise of progressive liberationism on the left, also began to say that the Bible is evil. So what happened is the nominals kind of caved in and left the devout exposed. And when the left began, or when the devout began to feel exposed, they began to look for cover. And I think, Trump was not the devout's first choice. Somebody more like Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz, they were the devout's, at least the Southern conservative devout's first choice. But Donald Trump ate their lunch. And so when you had the binary decision between Hillary or Trump would offer them cover by Supreme Court nominations and by other judge appointments, okay? And we know that politically. But again, to understand it is because, again, the nominal got harrowed out, the anti-theists came rushing in, the devout feel exposed, and they start looking for cover. Now, it's interesting that part of the reason some of the devout look at Jordan Peterson with hope is because he is hearkening back to a time in which a certain nominalism offered that supermajority that gave the devout cover. All right, that's what Keller is going through here.
I don't know why. Luis has to, because he's a scientist, he's not supposed to give too many ideas about where all these trends came from and what is going to happen next. But I have no handcuffs on me. I can pontificate all as I want. That's what I am. I'm a pontiff. I would say I'm pontificating away. Yes.
Presbyterian pontiff.
Oh, yeah, we have them. Calvin thought there was no problem with Presbyterian bishops, by the way, just to let you know.
They took that out of the script. My friend Eric Dirksen would be greatly heartened to hear that.
According to Wikipedia.org, the Script are an Irish pop band formed in 2001 in Dublin, Ireland. Their first release
Apparently Cortana is listening to me on another computer.
I can prove that. Oh, that's right. This is not off the record, is it? All right. I would say, to try to understand what's going on, if you go to a guy you go to Robert Bella, or you go to Charles Taylor, you go to the people that say that what's happening now is expressive individualism, like Charles Taylor calls it exclusive humanism, and it's the fruit of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment said that my reason, not trumped by revelation or tradition or anything else, is the way I'm going to find truth. It was interesting. Luc Ferry, who's a French philosopher, has written a book of his.
That's a really good book. In fact, I read it after I heard Keller mention it a number of times. Luc Ferry, A Brief History of Thought. It's a really, really wonderful little book.
I can't read French, so I can only read stuff that's translated. He wrote a book called A Brief History of Thought. And he actually says that idea that individual consciousness and reason is the arbiter of truth, it says, is actually like an acid that eats through its own container.
And this is basically what Jordan Peterson says Nietzsche pointed out.
In other words, what it does is it not only eats away at tradition and religion, but it actually eats away at everything. It eats away at all institutions. It eats away at anything that is going to trump my sovereign and sacred ability to decide what is right or wrong for me. And so that's the one side. And on the other side, there's the sociology of knowledge approach, which says, yes, social media and mobility and, the iPod, all those things. I mean, the iPod was the death of the music industry, and the idea that I have to get an album, and the idea that I should come to a concert and sit down and listen to all four, movements of the symphony, even the part that I find boring. So all that's going away. So you can do the sociology knowledge side, you can do a history, intellectual history side. For whatever reason, the center is coming off, and the people who are able to overcome the acids of individualism, you might say, are people that have to be really devout now. It's just not enough to simply say, I go to church, my father was Methodist and my grandfather was Methodist, so I'm a Methodist. I don't go to church very often. That's just all gone away. Now, here's why I think probably two things about this. That conservative Protestantism will grow moderately or stay, but I think it'll grow. Now, here's the reason why. I'm going to be a little optimistic. First of all, as we have already seen, it's white people mainly that are getting more secular in the world. White people. Just keep that.
Now, again, look at the Jordan Peterson movement. Now, again, its whiteness keeps getting trumpeted by the left, but it is a pretty white thing. And I think the reason it's white is, again, because this entire movement that Keller is pointing to has been a white movement. It's been the whites that have gone secular as an echo of Europe.
In mind, since most of you are. And there's a tendency, most of the people right here are, yeah. I'm sorry, let the transcript show. I'm talking about the people in the room. And there's a tendency for us to think like, it's just impossible not to overcome this practically. That, we're reality. And because so many of our people are getting more and more, secular and unaffiliated and so forth, this is the way the world's going, and it's just not true. I understand that by 2050, maybe only 30% of the world will be white, something like that. So white people are definitely getting more secular. Now, I am in a spot where I've seen, for reasons I'll tell you under my second heading, that I've seen a lot of disaffected Anglo-type people who have, go off to college, decided I can't find a Christianity or a faith that really works for me, and then gets recaptured by...
This is a lot of the Jordan Peterson crowd. I know, because I talk to you all.
Redeemer in churches in Manhattan. I can see that, and I do see, I don't know how statistically significant it is, maybe it's not much, but I do know we can hold our own with that crowd. I just know it can be done. We actually did a survey a couple years ago in which we looked at inside the center of New York City, which is Manhattan, south of the top of Central Park, and maybe extreme western New Jersey and extreme western Queens and Brooklyn. As many of you know, that's the sort of professional core of the city. It's about 1,050,000 people. We went through there, and as generously as possible, windshield survey, tried to identify every evangelical-ish Protestant church. And we, like I said, when I said evangelical-ish, I mean we were pretty fairly generous in our the Bebington 4 or 5. And also how many Manhattan residents go to those churches. And it took a lot of work, but we realized that in 1989 there were about 100 of those churches, about 9,000 Manhattan residents in it, which is less than 1% of the population. And in 2009, there was about 200 of those churches. My church helped start about a third of them, and there is now 34,000 Manhattan residents in those churches. Now, from one side, that's a big uptick. From the other side, it's still a fringe phenomenon. Nevertheless, it means holding your own or something like that. However, the reason why I still think that evangelicalism or maybe conservative Protestantism is going to probably hold its own and grow is because of the rise of global Christianity. Many of those folks are coming here, especially in the city. So,
in other words, what he's saying is that the conservative Protestant churches aren't going to cave necessarily, but what's going to happen is that there's going to continue to be influx from other places in the world. And here at Living Stones, our church continues to struggle, but there's a Nigerian Anglican church that uses our building. For a while, we had a Tongan church that used our building. So there are plenty of what would be Bebington 4+1 Christians coming into the United States from other places in the world.
Some real quicks, and these are, I don't totally trust any. I trust, when I read about 10 different versions of religious statistics and the fact that they kind of converge, then I can give you I trust that. And so here's what I do know. Korea, in 100 years, went from about 0 to 40% Christian. Africa, in 100 years, from 1900 to 2000, went from 9% to about 50% Christian. China is probably on a 100-year trajectory to do about the same thing, probably go from about 2 or 3% to maybe 30 or so. By the way, that's going to change history of the world right there, because some of you may know China's a little bigger than Korea. And of course, not as troubled as Africa. And so there's already more Pentecostal evangelical Christians in China than there are in all the United States. So now, what does that mean? It means that Christianity is growing in these non-Western places at 7 to 10 times the population in many cases, and they're coming to Western cities. The biggest churches by far in London right now are African churches. And what happened in New York, very interesting. In 1965, the Bronx, Brooklyn, and Queens were largely, outside of black Protestants, it was basically a Catholic Jewish place. There was a few scattered mainline churches, and that was about it. There's been an enormous influx, and there are now almost certainly 10% of all New Yorkers, out of the 8 million New Yorkers, 10% are Pentecostal Christians. My son is a urban planner, works for the city of New York. He's a city planner. He says when you go to Manhattan community boards, they are very secular. But if you go out into the Bronx and Queens and Brooklyn, places like that, he says community boards. And you know what a community board is? It's a public. It's where zoning decisions get made. It's half the community boards are appointed by the mayor and things like that. He says they're open and closed in prayer, especially in the Bronx, because it's all led by black and Latino Pentecostal ministers. They're the community leaders.
What did I say before about the split world? Well, in these areas, where in the United States, when you get a majority of a certain people in a certain religion, the religion will come into the public sphere, and by process, by the will of the people. We guess that 12 to 15% now of it's a guess, of the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn are probably what you call Bebington 5, Pentecostal or evangelical. Now, what happens is those folks are very ethnic. They're not from the Eastern Southern Europe, which is what used to dominate America, New York. It's from the Eastern Southern Hemisphere. And when they come, they win their own folks, and they grow, and they plant tons and tons of churches. And then when their kids grow up, go to college, learn to speak English, they come into the center. And that's why if you go into Redeemer, you'll see we're only about 43% white. Redeemer's 5,000 or 6,000 people coming. It's very 15% of the people who go to Redeemer either have their doctorate or are working on it. Out of the 6,000, it's 70% single. It's pretty unusual, and it's still a fringe phenomenon. Actually, it's not. It hasn't captured the cultural imagination. But the fact is that to a great degree, we are fueled by. I'll put a link to this recording, the whole recording, and it goes on for quite a while because he has question and answer, and goes into this. But you can see that the picture is a lot more complex than Noel Plum paints, and it's even more complex than let's say Adam sees in terms of Think Club. It's a very live picture in terms of what's happening religiously, and you can begin to see how Jordan Peterson fits into this. Now, what's amazing is that the professional atheists, what they really care about is the politics. If you're going to be a Christian and you're going to keep your mouth shut and you're not going to bother with the school system and you're not going to bother with the political realm, usually about the kinds of things that the celebrity atheists or the career atheists are pushing at, they'll leave you alone. And Richard Dawkins, the daddy of this group, says so basically on this. Unbelievable here.
I still worry about people who I know you're not one of them. But that there are people who think the Bible is literally true. There are people in America, many of them, who want to have the Ten Commandments hung up in courthouses, contrary to the Constitution. And although you can find a decent commandment among the 10, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor, etc., most of them you wouldn't actually want to base your life on. And yet there are people, I know you're not among them, but there are people who do think that we should derive our morals from the Ten Commandments, from the Old Testament.
What do you think about...
And Justin Brierley doesn't think that? Obviously, Richard Dawkins doesn't know a lot about Justin Brierley. But this is where, in a sense, we come to the Jordan Peterson moment, because Peterson, he's all over this in different ways. He's not an evangelical, but evangelicals can hear him, and they're thinking he might give them some cover. He's got mainline credentials, but he doesn't fit into the main line at all. He's got sacramentalist aspects to him through the symbolism and the archetypes and all of this. And you have Jonathan Peugeot saying, I don't read Jung, I read the church fathers. I don't call them archetypes, I call them symbolism. But so Peterson comes in the middle of it, and it's this mushy middle. It's the nominalism. It's the individuals that maybe gave up Christianity from a semi-devout family or from not a devout family. This is the group that Peterson is basically robbing the celebrity atheists of. The celebrity atheism is in very many ways in its last legs. And I actually found this little video on Tim Keller and the New Atheists, and he basically makes that point.
One bad thing about the New Atheist books is they weren't just saying that religion is wrong. They were actually saying that even respect for religion was wrong.
That's this mushy middle thing. And before, with the nominalists, they had the cover, and the New Atheists went in there and said, we're going to take away your cover.
And that we shouldn't even be courteous and respectful to religious believers, but we really just need to get rid of it all.
And now Peter Boghossian finds that the progressive liberationists are doing to the celebrity atheists what the celebrity atheists did to the nominalists and the Christian camp.
And boy, I think that's a recipe for disaster. That certainly doesn't bring about civil discourse at all.
And so what we see now is that not only do you have they're continuing to go after the nominal Christians and try and get them. They're, the devout they're fighting, but now more on the left are coming in, and so now you have increasing chaos and incivil discourse.
The other thing that's weird about the New Atheists was most people in the last 30 years came to understand that knowledge is perspectival. We've seemed to move away from this idea that you can have this objective view from nowhere.
This is, again, what we dealt with Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris.
The old Enlightenment, scientism. And I've talked to a number of philosophers who are not Christian believers, who are themselves atheists, actually, who told me it seems like all the guys who wrote the New Atheist books just refused to take Philosophy 101. They just did not listen to what's happened in the last 40 years about knowledge. They're just so sure that if you can't prove something, then we don't have to believe it. And so there's a kind of epistemological naivete about the books, and there's also something about them that I think really doesn't help civil discourse at all. So I do hope that they'll get passé.
What Tim Keller didn't know and what he couldn't see was that it would actually be Jordan Peterson who comes in and he hits all these different elements that were in practice. What Jordan Peterson has done in some ways is everyone assumed that the trends that Tim Keller saw in 2013 would simply continue. Well, Jordan Peterson comes in and it's a totally different ballgame. And that's, in a sense, how he fits into this. So let me know what you think of my thesis and put comments in the comments, and I'll wrap it up here.